The cabin sat like a forgotten secret deep in the Montana wilderness, its weathered logs barely visible through the October snow. Sarah clutched her swollen belly as another contraction ripped through her, 8 months pregnant and completely alone after her boyfriend abandoned her at a gas station 50 miles back. She had nowhere else to go. But Sarah wasn't just any desperate woman seeking shelter. She was Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist who specialized in cold cases, though she'd never mentioned her real expertise to anyone in this small town. As she pushed open the cabin door, her trained eye immediately caught something others would miss. The scratches on the doorframe weren't from animals. They were tally marks, dozens of them. But why did Sarah's own handwriting appear in entries dated 25 years ago, before she was even born? The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls as Sarah stared at the impossible entry. Her hands trembled as she traced the familiar loops and curves of her own penmanship, the same distinctive way she dotted her I's, with tiny circles instead of dots. The date at the top read October 15th, 1998. She hadn't been born until 1999. Day 3 in the cabin. The dreams are getting stronger. I see her face so clearly now. The woman who will come after me. She has my eyes, my stubborn chin. She's carrying a daughter, just like I am. The cycle continues. Sarah's breath caught. A daughter? Her ultrasounds had been inconclusive, the baby's position making it impossible to determine gender. But somehow, impossibly, this woman with her handwriting, had known. Another contraction seized her, stronger this time, and she doubled over. When the pain subsided, she forced herself to keep reading. The entries were scattered throughout the journal, different hands, different decades, but all telling eerily similar stories. Women fleeing abusive partners, unexpected pregnancies, dead-end lives that had led them to this remote cabin as if drawn by an invisible force. Night dreams, the man in my dream, that carry the gift. 1992, I understand now why I was led here. The bloodline must continue. The women of our family have always been guardians, though we forgot. She came to me again last night, the first mother. She told me about the others who will come, each generation stronger than the last. Sarah flipped frantically through the pages, searching for more entries in her handwriting. She found 2 more, each more disturbing than the last. October 17th, 1998. I know I won't leave this place. The baby is coming, and when she's born, I'll fade like the others. But she'll grow up strong, and one day she'll return. She'll be the one to break the cycle, or complete it. The final entry in her hand was dated the day she was supposedly born. October 22nd, 1998. I can feel myself becoming part of this place. My daughter will be raised by others, never knowing the truth until it's time. When she comes back, she'll think she's running from a broken life, but really, she'll be running toward her destiny. Tell her I loved her. Tell her I'm sorry. Sarah's hands shook violently. This was impossible, some kind of elaborate hoax. But as she examined the paper, her forensic training kicked in. The ink oxidation patterns were consistent with the dates. The paper aging was authentic, and the handwriting analysis would prove what her eyes already knew. This was genuinely her script. Outside, the storm intensified, and the temperature in the cabin dropped noticeably. Sarah wrapped herself in a dusty blanket she'd found on an old chair and continued reading other entries. Each woman described the same phenomena: dreams of previous inhabitants, knowledge they shouldn't possess, and an overwhelming sense that they belonged here. Several mentioned seeing figures in the woods, watchers who ensured they arrived safely. Others wrote about finding food and supplies that appeared overnight, as if the forest itself was caring for them. But most disturbing were the repeated references to the choice each woman would have to make when their time came. A sharp pain shot through Sarah's lower back, different from the contractions. This felt like labor beginning in earnest. She was alone, with no medical supplies, no way to call for help, and apparently carrying a baby that defied every law of genetics and time she understood. As if responding to her panic, A gentle warmth suddenly filled the cabin. The drafts stopped, and a soft glow seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. On the table beside her, a cup of steaming tea appeared, literally materialized, along with a plate of fresh bread. Sarah stared at the impossible offering, her scientific mind warring with the undeniable reality before her. Whatever was happening here transcended normal explanation, and according to the journal, her story had already been written 25 years ago. The question now was whether she would follow the same path as the others, or find a way to change an ending that seemed predetermined. The leather journal felt warm against Sarah's palms, as if it had been waiting for her touch. She settled deeper into the cabin's single armchair, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light that filtered through grimy windows. Her baby kicked restlessly, responding to her elevated heart rate as she opened the cover. The first page bore an inscription in faded blue ink. "For those who find sanctuary here, may you find the truth before it finds you." M. 1987. She turned the page carefully, the brittle paper threatening to tear. The handwriting changed, becoming more hurried, desperate. March 15th, 1987. My name is Catherine Wells. I'm 7 months pregnant and I don't know how I found this place, but I'm grateful. The dreams led me here, just like Eleanor said they would. The same dreams my mother had, and her mother before her. We're connected, all of us. The women who carry daughters. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly. Her ultrasound last month had confirmed what she'd somehow already known. She was carrying a girl. March 18th, 1987. Eleanor visited again today. She's been dead for 3 years, but she sits in that chair where you're probably sitting now, reader, and she tells me things. Terrible things about what they did to us, what they're still doing. The cabin protects us, but only temporarily. We can't stay forever. A chill ran down Sarah's spine despite the warm afternoon. She glanced at the chair's armrests, half expecting to see indentations from phantom hands. March 22nd, 1987. I understand now why the Morrison women die young, why they disappear. It's not coincidence or bad luck. It's systematic. They've been hunting us for generations, taking our daughters, studying us. Eleanor tried to break the cycle, but she failed. That's why she can't rest. Sarah flipped ahead frantically, searching for answers. The entries continued in different handwriting, different women, different years, but all pregnant, all carrying daughters, all somehow drawn to this place. June 3rd, 1993. Lisa Chen. The dreams started when I hit 6 months. A woman with kind eyes calling to me, showing me a path through the woods. When I told my doctor about the dreams, he got very interested, too interested. That's when I knew I had to run. October 12th, 1999. Maria Santos. They killed my sister when her daughter turned 16, made it look like an accident. But I saw the injection mark on her neck at the funeral. I won't let them take my baby. April 7th, 2003. Jennifer Morrison Hart. Yes, I'm Eleanor's great niece. The family connection isn't coincidence. We're all related somehow through bloodlines they've been tracking for decades. The Morrison gene is what they want, what they need. Sarah's maiden name was Morrison. Her mother had been a Morrison before marriage. The family tree she'd researched for a school project years ago suddenly took on sinister significance. She found an entry from just 2 years ago, September 14th, 2021. Amy Reeves. I traced the paper trail. The Meridian Institute has been documenting Morrison family births since 1952. They have files on all of us. They know when we're pregnant before we do sometimes. The genetic marker is dominant in females, recessive in males. That's why they only take the girls. The Meridian Institute. Sarah had never heard of it, but something about the name felt familiar, nagging at the edge of her memory. The final entry was recent, the ink still dark. November 8th, 2023, Rachel Morrison Davis. If you're reading this, Sarah, then the dreams worked. Yes, I know your name. Eleanor told me you'd come. You're our last hope. Check your medical records carefully. Look at who's been funding your prenatal care. The Institute has been watching you since childhood, waiting. Your baby is special. She's the first pure Morrison bloodline girl in 3 generations. They need her for the final phase. Sarah's blood turned to ice. November 8th was yesterday. This woman had been here yesterday, knew Sarah was coming, knew her name. She grabbed her purse with trembling hands and pulled out her insurance cards, her medical files. There, in small print on her prenatal care coverage, sponsored by Meridian Research Foundation. Her free prenatal care, the state-of-the-art clinic, the unusually attentive doctor who'd insisted on weekly visits. It had all been too good to be true. A sound outside made her freeze. Car engines coming up the mountain road, multiple vehicles. Sarah clutched the journal and struggled to her feet, her pregnant belly making quick movement difficult. Through the dirty window, she could see black SUVs emerging from the tree line. They'd found her, but now she knew why. The leather journal felt warm against Sarah's palms, as if it had been waiting for her touch. She settled into the dusty armchair by the window, where pale afternoon light filtered through grimy glass. The first page crackled as she opened it, revealing careful handwriting in faded blue ink. Just like the others said I would. I found this place just like the others said I would. When you need it most, it finds you. The key was exactly where she promised, under the 3rd loose stone. I don't understand how this works, but I'm grateful. The bleeding has stopped. Sarah's breath caught. She turned the page with trembling fingers. March 20th, 1987. Been here 5 days now. The pantry keeps filling itself. I know that sounds crazy, but every morning there's fresh bread, canned goods, sometimes even milk that's still cold. There's no refrigerator that works. I've checked every inch of this place. The well water tastes better than anything I've ever had. My morning sickness is completely gone. The handwriting was different on the next entry, bolder, more confident strokes. July 3rd, 1989. Rebecca was right about this place. The moment I stepped inside, I knew my baby would be safe. The cramps stopped immediately. I was spotting for weeks, certain I was losing her. The doctors said there was nothing they could do, but here everything changes. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly. She'd been spotting too, just light bleeding that her doctor had dismissed as normal. But normal felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, not when this pregnancy meant everything. August 12th, 1989. A dream of her every night now. The woman who owns this place. She's tall, with silver hair and the kindest eyes. She tells me the cabin chooses its visitors, that it's been protecting women like us for generations. When I ask her name, she just smiles and says I already know it. Page after page revealed similar stories. Different handwriting, different years, but always the same theme. Pregnant women in crisis finding sanctuary. Sarah found entries from the 1990s, the 2000s, even one dated just 2 years ago. October 1st, 2021. I can't explain what happened here, but Emma is thriving now. The ultrasound yesterday showed a perfectly healthy baby girl. The doctors are calling it a miracle. I know better. This place, it's like it exists outside normal rules. I'm leaving this journal for the next woman who needs it, and I'm adding something else, a photograph I found in the bedroom dresser. I think other women should see it. Sarah flipped ahead frantically until she found a small photograph tucked between pages. The black and white image showed a woman standing in front of the cabin, but the cabin looked newer, almost pristine. The woman was tall with silver hair, exactly as described in the entries, but it was her face that made Sarah's blood run cold. She knew that face. Not personally, but from family photographs tucked away in her grandmother's attic. The bone structure, the particular way the woman held her shoulders, even the shape of her hands, it was unmistakably familiar. Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling through her photo gallery until she found the picture she'd taken last Christmas. Her grandmother, Evelyn, at 93, still sharp and mysteriously evasive about her past. Sarah held the photograph next to her phone screen. A resemblance was impossible to ignore. This woman could be Evelyn's sister, or— "No," Sarah whispered to the empty cabin. "That's impossible." But even as she said it, memories surfaced. Her grandmother's strange comments about women's work and old responsibilities. The way Evelyn had reacted when Sarah mentioned feeling lost about her pregnancy. Her husband's recent deployment, her fear of being alone. Evelyn had gotten a peculiar look in her eyes and said, "Sometimes the things we need find us when we're ready." At the time, Sarah had thought it was just grandmother wisdom. Now it felt like something else entirely. Sarah turned back to the journal, searching for more clues. Near the end, she found an entry that made her heart stop. September 15th, 2019, and I finally worked up the courage to ask her directly. "The woman in my dreams told me this cabin has been in her family for over a century, that her grandmother started this tradition, and someday it would pass to someone else who understood the calling. She said the cabin chooses not just its visitors but its next guardian. When I asked how someone becomes a guardian, she said they usually don't know until they're ready." Sarah slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding. The silence of the cabin seemed to press against her eardrums. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. She stood abruptly, pacing to the kitchen and back. This was ridiculous. She was letting stress and pregnancy hormones make her paranoid. There had to be a logical explanation for all of this. But as she tried to convince herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was listening, waiting for her to understand something crucial, something that would change everything. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned to the next entry, dated 3 months after the previous one. The handwriting had grown shakier, more urgent. "They found me today. I thought I was safe here, thought the cabin would protect me like it did the others. But Dr. Reeves knows. He knows about the journal, about what I've discovered. He came with 2 men I didn't recognize, government types, clean-shaven and cold-eyed. They searched everything. He hid this journal in the floorboard just in time. Told them I was just a pregnant woman seeking shelter, nothing more." Dr. Reeves smiled that terrible smile of his and said I shouldn't worry about anything, that he was here to help. "But I've read the other entries. I know what his help means. If someone finds this, know that the injections aren't vitamins. The women who take them, their babies are different, changed. The government has been using us as test subjects for decades. This cabin isn't a refuge, it's a trap." Sarah's blood ran cold. The vitamins. Dr. Reeves had mentioned vitamins during her last appointment, said they'd help with the baby's development. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, but now— The next entry was in different handwriting altogether, shakier and more desperate. My name is Margaret Chen. It's 1987. I found this journal after the woman before me, Linda, disappeared. The caretaker said she went to the hospital for delivery, but I don't believe him. I've been watching from the woods and I've seen things. Men in suits come and go, equipment being moved in the dead of night. And the screaming, God, the screaming from the basement. I tried to leave yesterday, but my car wouldn't start. When I looked under the hood, the battery cables had been cut. I'm trapped here until the baby comes. I pray whoever finds this will be smarter than I was. Don't trust anyone. Don't take the injections, and whatever you do, don't let them take you to the basement." A floorboard creaked overhead. Sarah froze, listening intently. The sound came again, slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor above. Someone was in the cabin. Sarah clutched the journal to her chest and pressed herself against the far wall of the cellar, behind a stack of old crates. The baby kicked inside her, as if sensing her fear. She placed a protective hand over her belly and held her breath. The footsteps stopped directly overhead, a pause. Then the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The kitchen table, Sarah realized. They were moving it away from the trapdoor. Light suddenly flooded the cellar as the trapdoor opened. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and tried to make herself smaller behind the crates. Heavy boots appeared on the ladder rungs, descending slowly. "I know you're down here, Sarah." The voice was familiar, warm and reassuring. Dr. Reeves. But now that comforting tone only filled her with dread. "There's no need to hide, my dear. I'm here to help you, just like I helped all the others." Sarah's throat constricted. She could see his legs now, his crisp khaki pants and polished shoes. He reached the bottom of the ladder and stood there for a moment, surveying the cellar. "You've found Margaret's journal, haven't you? And Linda's entries too, I imagine." His voice carried a note of disappointment. "I had hoped we could do this the easy way, Sarah. Your grandmother was so much more cooperative." Her grandmother. Sarah's mind reeled. What did her grandmother have to do with any of this? Dr. Reeves took a step toward her hiding place. "The journal doesn't tell the whole story, you know. Those women were heroes, Sarah, pioneers. They helped us develop treatments that have saved countless lives. Your grandmother understood that. She understood the greater good." Another step closer. Sarah could smell his cologne now, the same scent that had always made her feel safe in his office. Now it made her nauseous. "The program has evolved since the early days. We're much more humane now, much more careful. What we're doing isn't just groundbreaking, it's necessary. The medications we've developed using the research from this place have prevented thousands of birth defects, saved thousands of babies." He was almost at the crates now. Sarah gripped the journal tighter, her knuckles white. She could hear her pulse thundering in her ears. "Come out, Sarah. Let me explain everything. Let me tell you about your family's important role in all of this, about why you were always meant to be here." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah made her choice. The silence in the cabin felt different now, charged with the weight of Margaret's words echoing in Sarah's mind. She clutched the journal tighter, her fingers tracing the worn leather binding as she tried to process what she'd read. The baby kicked sharply, as if sensing her distress, and she placed her free hand over her rounded belly. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows with an insistence that made her skin crawl. She needed to leave, to get back to town and figure out what all of this meant. But something held her rooted to the spot, a magnetic pull she couldn't explain, as if the cabin itself was alive and watching her. Sarah flipped through more pages, her eyes scanning for any mention of her grandmother's name. Most entries were brief clinical observations about the women who came and went. But then, near the middle of the journal, she found what made her blood run cold. "Elizabeth Hartwell arrived today. 3rd generation. The bloodline is strong in this one. She found us without any guidance, just like her mother and grandmother before her. Dr. Whitmore says the genetic markers are perfect. The baby will be especially valuable." The journal slipped from Sarah's trembling hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Elizabeth Hartwell was her grandmother's maiden name. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the implications. 3rd generation meant her great-grandmother had been here too, and what did they mean by genetic markers? Valuable for what? She bent to retrieve the journal, her movements clumsy with pregnancy and fear. As she did, something else caught her eye, a loose floorboard near the fireplace, its edge slightly raised as if it had been recently disturbed. Sarah crawled over to it, her heart hammering against her ribs. The board lifted easily, revealing a small space beneath. Inside was a metal box, its surface tarnished but intact. With shaking hands, she pulled it out and opened it. Inside were dozens of photographs, yellowed with age. The first few showed women in various stages of pregnancy, all standing in front of this very cabin. Some looked happy, others terrified. But it was the dates scrawled on the backs that made Sarah's stomach lurch. 1952, 1978, 1995, 2001, 2001. She shuffled through them frantically until she found what she was looking for. A young woman with dark hair and familiar green eyes, standing awkwardly beside the cabin's front door. The date on the back read 1978, and in faded ink, Elizabeth Hartwell, 22 weeks. Her grandmother, 22 weeks pregnant with Sarah's mother. Beneath the photographs was a folder filled with medical documents, birth certificates, blood test results, adoption papers. Sarah's hands shook as she read through them, the pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place. Every woman who had come to this cabin had given birth here, and every baby had been taken. But according to these records, The babies weren't being sold or trafficked in any conventional sense. They were being placed with specific families, all of whom shared certain genetic characteristics. The paperwork was stamped with the letterhead of the Whitmore Foundation, and at the bottom of each document was the same notation: M Project Continuation, Phase 3 complete. Sarah's phone buzzed, making her jump. A text from David, getting worried. Storm's getting bad. Are you okay? She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain any of this? How could she tell him that her entire family history was apparently a lie, that she and her unborn daughter were part of some twisted genetic experiment spanning generations? Another gust of wind shook the cabin, and this time she heard something else, the sound of a car engine cutting through the storm. Sarah scrambled to the window and peered out through the rain-streaked glass. Headlights were winding up the narrow road toward the cabin. Panic flooded her system. She shoved the photographs and documents back into the box, grabbed the journal, and looked around frantically for another way out. The back door was her only option. She could slip out and hide in the woods until whoever was coming had left. But as she reached for the door handle, she heard car doors slamming and voices calling out through the rain. One of them made her freeze in terror. "Sarah? Sarah, are you in there? It's Dr. Chen." "We know you're here, dear," came another voice, older and unfamiliar. "There's no need to be frightened. We're here to help you, just like we helped your grandmother and your mother." Sarah pressed herself against the back door, her mind racing. They knew. They'd known all along that she would come here, had probably been tracking her somehow. The genetic pull she'd felt wasn't mystical. It was programmed, bred into her bloodline over generations. The front door handle rattled, and she knew she was out of time. The drive back to town felt endless, each mile stretching like an eternity, as Sarah's mind raced faster than her aging Honda could manage. The journal sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in her jacket like some sacred relic or dangerous evidence. Every few minutes she found herself glancing at it, half expecting it to have vanished like some fever dream. But it remained stubbornly real, just as the ache in her lower back reminded her that her pregnancy was advancing whether she understood her circumstances or not. 26 weeks now, and the baby seemed more active than usual, as if responding to her elevated stress levels. Sarah pulled into the parking lot of the Millfield Public Library, a modest brick building that had served the community for over 60 years. If anyone would have records about the cabin's ownership, it would be here. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had been a fixture in town longer than most of the buildings. The familiar scent of old books and floor wax greeted her as she pushed through the heavy glass doors. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her desk, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the humid afternoon. "Sarah, dear, how are you feeling?" The woman's eyes immediately went to Sarah's rounded belly. "Not long now." "Actually, I have about 3 months left," Sarah replied, managing a smile. "Mrs. Patterson, I was wondering if you could help me with something. I'm trying to research some property records. There's a cabin up on Birch Mountain Road." "Oh," Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "That old place. May I ask why you're interested?" The question seemed loaded with unspoken warning. Sarah hesitated, then decided on partial truth. "I found it while hiking last week. It's such a beautiful spot, and I was curious about its history." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in looking at public records. Follow me." They moved to a back corner where filing cabinets lined the walls like sentinels. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across a nearby table. "The property has quite a history. Built in 1952 by a man named Theodore Blackwood. He was something of a local mystery, came here from back east with more money than anyone could explain." Sarah leaned closer, studying a faded photograph of a stern-looking man in his 50s. "What happened to him?" "Disappeared in 1967. Just vanished one day, leaving everything behind. The property went through probate, then passed to various family members over the years. Mrs. Patterson's finger traced through the ownership timeline. Currently belongs to his granddaughter, though I don't believe she's ever set foot in Millfield. Do you know her name? Mrs. Patterson flipped to another page. Elizabeth Blackwood Chen. Lives in Seattle, I believe. Sarah's blood turned cold. Elizabeth. The name from the journal. The woman who had written about her own pregnancy, her own fears about the family legacy she was trapped in. But that entry was dated 15 years ago. Could it be the same person? Mrs. Patterson, did Theodore Blackwood have any connection to medical research or anything involving pregnant women? The librarian's hands stilled on the papers. When she looked up, her face had gone pale. Sarah, dear, why would you ask such a specific question? I found some things at the cabin that made me curious. Mrs. Patterson glanced around the empty library, then leaned closer. There were rumors back in the day, stories about women going up to that cabin when they were expecting. Some said Theodore was helping them, others said... She shook her head. But those were just old gossip, the kind of tales that grow in small towns. What kind of help? The kind that desperate women seek when they have nowhere else to turn. Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But Sarah, if you found something up there, something that's making you ask these questions, maybe you should speak to someone official. Sheriff Morrison has been around long enough to remember some of those old stories. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she trusted anyone in authority yet. Not until she understood more about what she'd stumbled into. Could I get copies of these ownership records? Of course. Mrs. Patterson moved to the copy machine, but her movements seemed reluctant. Sarah, promise me you'll be careful. That cabin, it has a way of drawing certain women to it. Always has. And not all of their stories ended well. As Sarah waited for the copies, she pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. The child seemed to be reacting to something, her stress, the conversation, or perhaps something else entirely, something she was only beginning to understand. The copies felt warm in her hands as she thanked Mrs. Patterson and headed for the door. She had a name now, a potential connection between past and present. Elizabeth Blackwood Chen might hold the answers she desperately needed. But first, she needed to read more of that journal. The truth was waiting in those pages, and her baby's future might depend on uncovering it. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at her grandmother's face, decades younger but unmistakably familiar. Elena stood beside the cabin's front porch, one hand resting protectively over a swollen belly, the other gripping the arm of a tall man whose face had been deliberately scratched out with what looked like a knife. Sarah's legs gave way, and she sank onto the dusty floor, still clutching the journal and photograph. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as if sensing her distress. Everything she thought she knew about her family was crumbling like the rotting floorboards beneath her. She flipped through more pages of the journal, her grandmother's handwriting becoming increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. The words blurred together through Sarah's tears, but certain phrases leaped out at her like accusations. When they promised it would be safe here. They promised the old ways would protect us. One man from the city came again today. He says the contract must be honored. I told him I changed my mind, but he just smiled. And I can feel her moving inside me. She knows. Somehow she knows what they plan to do. Sarah's blood ran cold. She pressed her palm against her own belly, feeling the familiar flutter of movement. The journal entries were dated over 50 years ago, but the fear bleeding through her grandmother's words felt immediate and real. A loose page fell from between the journal's back cover, covered in different handwriting, masculine sharp strokes in black ink. Sarah unfolded it carefully, noting how the paper seemed newer than the rest. The terms remain unchanged. Each generation provides one. The location serves its purpose well, isolated, forgotten, perfect for our needs. The women come willingly, believing they've found sanctuary. They never suspect they've simply answered a call that runs in their blood. Current subjects show promising genetic markers. The silver line has been particularly productive. Elena's contribution was adequate. We have high hopes for the next generation. The signature at the bottom was illegible, but there was a symbol, a circle containing interlocking triangles that looked disturbingly familiar. Sarah frantically searched her memory before remembering where she'd seen it. Carved into the old oak tree outside, the one that had somehow called to her when she first arrived. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Haven't heard from you. Getting worried. Call me. Sarah stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain what she'd found? How could she tell him that her own grandmother had been part of some twisted conspiracy and that Sarah herself might be walking into the same trap? Another text appeared. A GPS shows you're still at the cabin. Are you okay? Sarah's stomach lurched. She'd turned off location services days ago, hadn't she? She quickly checked her phone settings, her hands shaking. Everything was disabled, yet somehow Marcus knew exactly where she was. The sound of tires on gravel outside made her freeze. Through the grimy window, she could see a black sedan pulling up next to her car. Two figures emerged, a man in an expensive suit and a woman carrying what looked like a medical bag. Sarah's mind raced. The journal entries mentioned visitors, people who came to check on the pregnant women who found their way to the cabin. Her grandmother had written about a man from the city, someone who spoke of contracts and obligations. She stuffed the journal and photograph into her jacket and moved carefully toward the back of the cabin, avoiding the creaking floorboards she'd learned to identify over the past few days. The back door was swollen with moisture and wouldn't budge silently, so she headed for the window she'd noticed earlier. Voices carried from the front porch. The woman's tone was clinical, professional. The tracking device in her phone shows she's been here for 3 days. Perfect timing. The pregnancy should be far enough along. And if she resists like the grandmother did? The man's voice was cold, familiar in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. The old woman's resistance ultimately didn't matter. The procedure was completed successfully. This one will be no different. Sarah managed to force the window open just enough to squeeze through, biting back a gasp as a splinter caught her jacket. She could hear footsteps on the front porch now, the sound of the door being tested. Her car keys were useless. They'd block her exit easily, but she remembered seeing an old trail leading into the woods behind the cabin, probably a hunting path that might connect to the main road miles away. As she slipped into the tree line, Sarah heard the cabin door bang open behind her. She pressed deeper into the forest, one hand protecting her belly, the other clutching the journal that held the terrible truth about her family's legacy. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her child was urging her to run faster. The leather journal felt heavier in Sarah's hands as she settled into the dusty armchair by the cabin's stone fireplace. The afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows cast long shadows across the pages, making the faded ink appear to writhe like living things. She had to know more about Elena, about what had happened in this place decades ago. Elena's handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. Sarah flipped past several pages of routine observations about the cabin's supplies and the changing seasons until she found an entry dated October 15th, 1962. "This woman came again today, Dr. Whitmore's assistant," she says, "but there's something cold about her eyes that reminds me of a snake. She asked about the baby, about when it's due, about my family history. When I told her I had no family to speak of, she smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. She left me vitamins, large, chalky white pills that smell like metal. I threw them in the fire after she left." Sarah's breath caught. Dr. Whitmore. She'd heard that name before, whispered in hushed conversations between her grandmother and great-aunt when they thought she wasn't listening. Something about the old doctor who used to treat women in the mountain communities, though the details had always been frustratingly vague. She turned the page, her heart racing as Elena's story unfolded. October 22nd, 1962. She returned with the doctor himself this time. Dr. Whitmore is older than I expected, with silver hair and soft hands that lingered too long when he examined me. He seemed disappointed when I told him about the vitamins, insisting they were essential for the baby's development. "Special circumstances require special care," he said, his pale eyes boring into mine. They left more pills, and this time they watched me swallow one before they departed. I forced myself to keep it down until they were gone, then vomited it up in the woods. "Something is very wrong here." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of life within. The same sensation Elena must have experienced all those years ago. But what had Dr. Whitmore really wanted with these isolated, vulnerable women? The next entry was dated nearly a week later, and Elena's handwriting had deteriorated further. "October 2008, 1962. I've been pretending to take the pills, hiding them in my cheek and spitting them out later, but today I found something that made my blood run cold. While exploring the cellar for more canned goods, I discovered a loose board behind the shelves. Underneath was a metal box containing photographs and documents. Pictures of pregnant women, dozens of them, all taken here in this cabin. Some of the faces looked familiar, girls from town who disappeared years ago, supposedly run off to the city or married strangers from distant places. But it was the documents that truly terrified me. Birth certificates with false names, medical records detailing experimental prenatal treatments, and correspondence between Dr. Whitmore and someone identified only as the Foundation. The letters spoke of genetic testing, of identifying bloodlines with unique properties, of the importance of maintaining specimen integrity during gestation. "And we aren't patients, we're experiments." Sarah's hands began to tremble as she read. The Foundation. That name triggered a memory from childhood, something overheard during one of her grandmother's rare visits. A hushed phone conversation about keeping the family history quiet and making sure they never connected the dots. Elena's final entries painted a picture of growing paranoia and desperation. She wrote about hearing footsteps around the cabin at night, about finding signs that someone had been inside while she was out gathering firewood. The doctor's visits became more frequent, his questions more insistent, and always the pressure to take the mysterious white pills. November 3rd, 1962. I know they're watching me. Dr. Whitmore came today with two men I'd never seen before. They searched the cabin while he distracted me with his examination. I could hear them moving things around, going through my few possessions with methodical precision. They didn't find the journal. I've been keeping it hidden in the hollow space beneath the floorboard under the bed. But they found the hidden pills I'd been collecting. Dr. Whitmore's mask of kindly concern finally slipped. "Elena," he said, his voice soft but menacing, "you're carrying something very precious, something that belongs to us. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way, but either way that child will fulfill its purpose." I asked him what purpose, what he meant by "belongs to us." He smiled that cold reptilian smile and said, "Your bloodline has been in our care for 3 generations, my dear. Your grandmother, your mother, and now you. Each pregnancy has brought us closer to perfecting the process. Your child will be the culmination of decades of careful breeding and enhancement." Sarah slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echoing in the cabin's silence. Bloodline. 3 generations. The implications crashed over her like ice water, and suddenly her grandmother's secretiveness, her mother's strange reluctance to discuss family history, the way certain relatives seemed to vanish from family stories. It all began to make terrifying sense. She wasn't here by accident. She'd been led here, just like Elena, just like the others. And somewhere out there, they were still watching. The old photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the woman who shared her face. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, even the same way of holding her head slightly tilted when uncertain. But this woman stood beside a younger version of Dr. Henley, both of them positioned in front of the very cabin where Sarah now sat. "My grandmother," she whispered, though speaking the words aloud made them no less impossible to believe. She flipped the photograph over, hoping for a date or name, and found both in faded ink: Margaret Chen, 1962. First successful subject. The clinical language sent ice through her veins. Subject. Not patient, not woman, not even person. Subject. Sarah's hands moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby kicked as if sensing her distress. Whatever had happened to her grandmother in 1962, it had started here, in this cabin, with Dr. Henley. And now Sarah had found her way to the same place, carrying the next generation. She forced herself to keep reading, even as her vision blurred with tears. The entries detailed her grandmother's pregnancy with clinical precision: weight gain, blood pressure readings, behavioral observations. But scattered between the medical notes were more personal comments that revealed Dr. Henley's true obsession. Subject exhibits unusual resilience to pharmaceutical interventions. Pregnancy progressing despite multiple exposure attempts. Genetic markers suggest natural immunity may be hereditary trait we've been seeking. The words swam before Sarah's eyes. Exposure attempts. They had tried to harm her grandmother's pregnancy, to end it, and when they couldn't, they became fascinated by whatever protected the baby, Sarah's mother. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Where are you? Been calling for hours. Getting worried." Sarah stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the reply button. How could she possibly explain where she was or what she'd discovered? That her entire family history was built on lies. That she'd been drawn to this cabin not by chance, but by some twisted legacy of surveillance and experimentation? It wasn't entirely a lie. She was physically safe for now, but emotionally, mentally, she felt herself fragmenting with each new revelation. The journal entries continued through her grandmother's pregnancy and beyond, documenting the birth of Sarah's mother and the careful orchestration of her placement with an adoptive family. Dr. Henley had arranged everything, ensuring the baby would be raised by people who believed her parentage was unknown, people who would dutifully report back on the child's development and health. Successful delivery of female infant. Subject's protective genetic factors appear to have transferred. Adoptive placement secured with secondary research team members. Long-term monitoring protocol initiated. Sarah felt sick. Her adoptive grandparents, the people who had raised her mother with such apparent love and care, had been part of the conspiracy all along. Every milestone, every achievement, every struggle had been documented and reported back to Dr. Henley's research project. The pattern repeated with her mother's generation. More coded entries, more clinical observations, more exposure attempts that failed. Her mother's fertility struggles, which had always been attributed to stress and age, took on a sinister new meaning. How many of those struggles had been artificially induced? And now Sarah understood why she'd been so drawn to this place. It wasn't intuition or fate that had led her here. She'd been conditioned, just like her mother and grandmother before her. Subliminal suggestions embedded in medical consultations, subtle influences from people she trusted, all designed to bring her to this cabin when she was most vulnerable. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Sarah felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. Whatever her grandmother had passed down, whatever genetic anomaly made their bloodline so interesting to Dr. Henley's successors, it had kept 3 generations of babies alive, despite everything thrown at them. She gathered the photographs and documents, stuffing them into her jacket. The journal was too large to hide, but she managed to tear out the most damning pages. If she was going to confront this conspiracy, she needed proof. As she prepared to leave the cabin, Sarah noticed something she'd missed before: fresh tire tracks in the mud outside, too recent to be from her own arrival. Someone else had been here recently, someone who might be watching even now. The protection her bloodline carried came with a price: eternal surveillance by people who saw her not as a human being, but as a research specimen. And now they knew she'd found their secrets. The basement door groaned as Sarah descended into the earth beneath the cabin, her phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. The air grew thick and musty, carrying scents of damp wood and something else, something metallic that made her stomach churn. Each step down the wooden stairs felt like a betrayal of every survival instinct, screaming at her to turn back. The beam of light revealed a small, cramped space with stone walls that wept moisture. But it wasn't the dampness that made Sarah's breath catch. It was what the walls contained. Shelves lined every surface, and on those shelves sat dozens of glass jars, each one filled with a pale, floating mass suspended in murky liquid. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly as understanding crashed over her like ice water. These weren't specimens from some long-ago scientific study. They were trophies. A metal table dominated the center of the room, its surface stained dark despite obvious attempts to clean it. Leather straps hung from each corner, and Sarah didn't need to examine them closely to understand their purpose. Above the table, a single bare bulb dangled from a wire, and she fumbled along the wall until she found an old light switch. A filing cabinet in the corner drew her attention, and with trembling hands she pulled open the top drawer. Inside were manila folders, each labeled with a woman's name and date. Sarah recognized some of the names from Eleanor's journal entries, women who had supposedly found safety and new lives elsewhere, women who had never left this basement alive. She pulled out a folder marked Margaret Chen, 1987, and opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a photograph of a young Asian woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, along with what looked like medical notes written in her grandfather's careful handwriting. The notes detailed Margaret's pregnancy, how far along she was, the health of the fetus, and planned procedures that made Sarah's vision blur with nausea. Another folder contained photos and notes about a woman named Diane Foster from 1993, then Rebecca Martinez from 1999. Each folder followed the same pattern, a photograph, medical notes, and a final entry that simply read procedure complete, specimen preserved. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, and she nearly dropped it in her shock. The message was from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have gone down there, Sarah. Come upstairs, we need to talk." Her blood turned to ice. Someone knew she was here. Someone was watching. She stuffed several of the folders into her jacket and moved toward the stairs, but froze when she heard footsteps on the floor above. Heavy, deliberate steps that moved across the cabin's main room. The front door creaked open, then closed with a soft click. "Sarah?" a voice called down. "I know you're here. Your car is outside." The voice was familiar, but she couldn't immediately place it. It was male, older, with the careful pronunciation of someone used to being listened to. Sarah turned off the basement light and crept up the stairs in darkness, guided only by the faint glow from her phone. "There's no point in hiding," the voice continued. "We've been watching you since you first arrived. Did you really think we wouldn't notice someone poking around Eleanor's old place?" Sarah reached the top of the basement stairs and peered through the crack in the door. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the cabin's windows, someone in an expensive coat with silver hair that caught the afternoon light. When he turned slightly, Sarah's heart nearly stopped. It was Dr. Harrison Webb, the family physician who had delivered her 28 years ago, the same doctor who had been caring for her throughout her pregnancy. The man she had trusted with her life and her baby's life was standing in the cabin where dozens of women had died. "Your grandfather would be so disappointed, Sarah," Dr. Webb said, his voice carrying easily through the small space. "He worked so hard to protect you from all this, to make sure you would never have to know what really happened to your grandmother, or why your mother was so desperate to keep you away from this place." Sarah's mind reeled. Her grandfather, the gentle man who had raised her after her parents died, had been part of this, had known about the basement, the jars, the women who disappeared. "But you just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Dr. Webb continued, moving closer to the basement door. "Just like Eleanor, always asking questions, always digging where you shouldn't dig." The handle on the basement door began to turn. The basement of the Millbrook Library felt like a tomb. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled another dusty box from the metal shelving, the musty air making her already queasy stomach churn. 3 hours of searching through archive records had yielded fragments. newspaper clippings about missing women, birth certificates with falsified information, and a pattern that made her blood run cold. "Find anything?" Marcus whispered, though they were alone in the archives. Sarah held up a yellowed newspaper from 1987. "Listen to this. Local woman Jennifer Hayes, 7 months pregnant, disappeared while hiking near Pine Ridge. Search teams found no trace despite extensive efforts. The same month, a birth certificate was filed for a baby born to unknown parents at Millbrook General." Marcus leaned closer, studying the document. "That's not a coincidence. There are dozens of these." Sarah's voice cracked. Pregnant women disappearing, babies appearing in the system with no real documentation, all within a 20-mile radius of that cabin. The overhead fluorescent buzzed ominously as Sarah reached for another box. Inside, she found what she'd been dreading, a manila folder marked Blackwood Family Trust. Confidential. Her maiden name stared back at her like an accusation. With shaking fingers, she opened the folder. The first document was a property deed dated 1952, transferring ownership of a remote cabin and surrounding land to Eleanor Blackwood, Sarah's grandmother, the woman who had supposedly died in a car accident when Sarah's mother was just a baby. "This can't be right," Sarah breathed. "My grandmother died decades ago." Marcus pointed to a notation in the margin. "Look at this renewal date. The trust was updated 5 years ago. Someone's still managing this property." Sarah flipped through more pages, finding financial records showing regular payments to various individuals, doctors, nurses, clerks at the Vital Records office. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't random. This was organized, systematic, and had been running for generations. A loose photograph fell from the folder, landing face up on the concrete floor. Sarah gasped. The image showed a woman in a 1950s dress standing in front of the cabin, but it wasn't the woman's face that made Sarah's world tilt. It was the resemblance, the same dark hair, the same angular features, the same green eyes Sarah saw in the mirror every morning. "Sarah, you need to see this." Marcus had moved to another box and was holding a leather-bound ledger. "It's a record book. Names, dates, outcomes." Sarah forced herself to look. The entries were clinical, cold, subject delivered August 15, 1987. Male infant, healthy. Mother disposed of as per protocol. Infant placed with Hartford family via standard channels. Disposed of. The words echoed in Sarah's head. These weren't medical records. They were business transactions. Human trafficking disguised as unofficial adoptions, with pregnant women as unwilling suppliers. She turned the page and froze. There, in familiar handwriting, was an entry from just 6 months ago. Subject K. Morrison delivered 4/22. Female infant, minor complications. Mother chose non-compliance. Standard resolution applied. "Katie Morrison," Sarah whispered. "She was my co-worker. She went on maternity leave and never came back. We were told she moved out of state." Marcus's face had gone pale. "Standard resolution?" Sarah didn't want to know, but she kept reading. The clinical language couldn't disguise the truth. Women who refused to surrender their babies simply vanished. Those who complied were given new identities and relocated, never to see their children again. It was a machine designed to separate mothers from babies, feeding a black market adoption network that stretched across multiple states. The baby kicked hard against Sarah's ribs, as if sensing her distress. She placed a protective hand over her stomach, understanding now why the cabin had felt so familiar, why she'd been drawn there during her most vulnerable moment. Generations of Blackwood women had been running this operation, and somehow Sarah had been selected as the next link in the chain. "We have to get out of here," Marcus said, gathering the documents. "If they're monitoring—" The basement lights suddenly cut out, plunging them into absolute darkness. Sarah's breath caught as she heard the distinct sound of the upstairs door closing, followed by the mechanical click of a lock engaging. "I'm here." His hand found hers in the darkness. There has to be another way out. But Sarah already knew there wasn't. The basement had only one entrance, and now they were trapped with evidence that could destroy a decades-old conspiracy. Her phone showed no signal this far underground, and the weight of her pregnancy made every movement feel labored. In the suffocating darkness, surrounded by the documented horrors of her family's legacy, Sarah finally understood the true purpose of the journal she'd found. It hadn't been a warning, it had been bait. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the journal open before her. She'd been awake since dawn, reading and rereading the entries, trying to piece together the fragments of truth that seemed to shift like smoke every time she thought she understood. Margaret's handwriting had grown increasingly erratic in the final entries, the careful script deteriorating into desperate scrawls. Sarah traced her finger along the words, feeling the indentations where the pen had pressed deep into the paper. "No, I've been keeping records. Dr. Whitmore came by yesterday, asking questions about the other women. Said he was concerned about my mental state. Mental state, as if seeing the truth makes me crazy." A floorboard creaked behind her, and Sarah spun around to find David standing in the doorway. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "You're still reading that thing," he said, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "There's more here, David. So much more than we realized." Sarah closed the journal protectively. Margaret wasn't just some woman who lived here, she was documenting something, a pattern. David moved closer, and Sarah noticed he was favoring his left leg slightly. When had he hurt himself? "Sarah, you need to listen to me carefully." He sat down across from her, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Last night, after you fell asleep, I did some calling around. Asked some questions." "What kind of questions?" "About this place. About your family." David's eyes didn't meet hers. "About why you really found this cabin." The baby kicked, a sharp jab against Sarah's ribs that made her gasp. Something in David's tone made her skin crawl, a cold certainty that whatever he was about to tell her would change everything. "The deed to this property," David continued, "it's been in the same family for over 60 years, but not your family, Sarah. It belongs to the Whitmore Trust." The name hit her like ice water. Dr. Whitmore, the same name Margaret had written about in increasingly fearful terms. "That's impossible. The GPS led us here by accident." "Did it?" David pulled out his phone, showing her the screen. "I checked the navigation history. This address was programmed in before we even left the city. Someone wanted us to come here." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the journal again, flipping to one of Margaret's later entries. The words seemed to pulse on the page, and the young ones always think they found this place by chance. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. "David, we need to leave, right now." Sarah started to stand, but David's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "I'm afraid that's not possible." The voice that came from David's mouth was still his, but the inflection was wrong, the cadence foreign. Sarah stared at him, really looked at him, and noticed details that hadn't registered before. The small bandage behind his left ear, the way his pupils seemed slightly dilated. The fact that he'd been gone for over an hour last night, claiming he needed to get better cell reception. "What did they do to you?" she whispered. David's grip tightened. "They helped me understand. This place, Sarah, it's not what you think. The women who come here, they're not random. They're selected, chosen because of specific genetic markers that make their children valuable." Sarah jerked her hand free and backed toward the window. "You're not making sense. Your grandmother came here in 1962, your mother in 1984, both pregnant, both carrying daughters who would eventually carry the same genetic anomaly forward." David stood slowly, blocking her path to the door. "You were always going to end up here, Sarah. The only question was when." The journal slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, falling open to a page she hadn't noticed before. Margaret's handwriting was barely legible, and then who bring them don't remember afterward. Some kind of conditioning. They think they're being helpful, protective. They never realize they're delivering the women directly into the hands of those who want to harvest what they carry. The baby, Sarah breathed, her hand instinctively covering her belly. Perfectly safe, as long as you cooperate. David's smile was gentle, loving, and completely wrong. Dr. Whitmore just wants to run some tests, monitor the pregnancy. The same care your family has been receiving for generations. Through the window, Sarah saw a black sedan pulling up the dirt road, dust swirling in its wake. Her phone was upstairs, her car keys were in David's pocket, and the man she loved was looking at her with eyes that weren't quite his own. Margaret's final entry echoed in her mind. When the only way out is through the woods, follow the creek upstream. There's an old hunting trail that leads to the highway, but go at night and pray they don't have the dogs. Sarah calculated the distance to the back door, wondering if she could make it, before David realized what she was planning. The sedan's doors slammed shut outside, and footsteps approached the porch. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the latest journal entry, the ink still fresh enough to smudge against her fingertips. The handwriting belonged to her cousin Maya, who had supposedly died in a car accident 3 months ago. The same Maya whose funeral Sarah had attended, whose casket she had watched lowered into the ground. Tay told me the baby would be safe here. They lied about everything else, but maybe not about that. If anyone finds this, know that the Whitmore Foundation isn't what it seems. The women who come here, we're not refugees, we're livestock. The word livestock sent ice through Sarah's veins. She pressed her back against the cabin's rough wooden wall, feeling her unborn child shift restlessly in her womb, as if sensing her terror. Through the dusty window, she could see headlights winding up the mountain road. They had found her. The headlights grew brighter. Sarah grabbed the journal and stuffed it into her jacket, then moved toward the cabin's back door. Her ankle, twisted during her desperate climb up the mountain, screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop now. Not when she finally understood why pregnant women kept finding this place and why so many of them never left. She slipped out into the cold night air, her breath forming clouds in the moonlight. The forest seemed alive with shadows, every rustling branch a potential threat. Behind her, car doors slammed, and she heard voices, Dr. Chen's calm, measured tone among them. "Sarah, we know you're here. The GPS tracker and your prenatal vitamins led us right to you." Of course, the vitamins she'd been taking religiously, believing they were protecting her baby. Instead, they'd been a leash, keeping her tethered to whatever nightmare she'd stumbled into. She pressed deeper into the woods, following what looked like an old deer trail. The journal entries from dozens of women over the decades painted a horrifying picture. The Whitmore Foundation hadn't been helping pregnant women, they'd been breeding them, selecting for specific genetic traits, manipulating circumstances to bring the right women to this isolated location where they could be monitored, controlled, and ultimately harvested. Sarah's own mother had been here. The journal contained an entry in her familiar looping handwriting from 35 years ago. "And they promised me a safe place to have my baby. Instead, they've turned me into a lab rat. If I ever have a daughter, I'll make sure she never knows about this place. I'll protect her from the truth." But the truth had found Sarah anyway, the way it found all the women in her family line eventually. She stumbled over a fallen log, catching herself against a tree trunk. The bark scraped against her palm, and she felt something warm and sticky. Blood. In the distance, flashlight beams swept through the trees like searching fingers. "Sarah, you're making this harder than it needs to be," Dr. Chen called out. "Think about your baby, the medications you need, the specialized care we can provide." Specialized care? Sarah almost laughed at the euphemism. Maya's final journal entry had described the care: forced bed rest, constant monitoring, experimental drugs injected directly into the amniotic fluid. And when the babies were born, they disappeared into the Foundation's network, raised by carefully selected families who had no idea about their children's true origins. A branch snapped somewhere to her left. They were closing in. Sarah pressed on, following the trail deeper into the woods. Her phone had no signal this far up the mountain, but maybe if she could reach the other side, get to the highway, she could flag down help. Someone who wasn't part of the Foundation's web of complicity. The trees began to thin ahead, and she could see lights in the distance. Not flashlights, electric lights. A building. Hope flared in her chest until she got close enough to make out the sign, Whitmore Foundation Research Facility. Authorized personnel only. She had been herded here like a sheep to slaughter. The cabin, the journal, even her escape route, all of it carefully orchestrated to bring her exactly where they wanted her. Her mother's desperate attempt to break the cycle had only delayed the inevitable. Sarah sank to her knees in the pine needles, feeling the weight of generations of manipulation crushing down on her. Her daughter, and somehow she knew it was a daughter, would grow up in their system, bred for the same fate that had claimed her mother, her grandmother, and who knew how many others. But then she felt it, a strong kick from inside her womb, her daughter, fighting back already. Sarah struggled to her feet, wiping the tears from her cheeks. The Foundation might have orchestrated everything else, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had given her the truth, and the truth, Sarah realized, could be a weapon. The basement stairs creaked under Sarah's weight as she descended into the darkness, her phone's flashlight cutting through the musty air. The wooden steps felt solid despite their age, but each footfall seemed to echo with the weight of decades-old secrets waiting to be unearthed. The basement was larger than she'd expected, stretching beyond the cabin's footprint. Stone walls glistened with moisture, and the air carried a metallic scent that made her stomach turn. Sarah swept the light across the space, revealing shelves lined with mason jars, their contents long since spoiled and unrecognizable. But it was the far wall that drew her attention, a section where the stone looked newer, cleaner. As she approached, she could see the mortar between the blocks was different, whiter than the rest. Someone had sealed something behind this wall, and recently. Sarah ran her fingers along the edges, feeling for loose stones. The baby kicked, as if sensing her agitation. "What are you hiding?" she whispered to the darkness. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Where are you?" Getting worried. The lie tasted bitter, but she couldn't bring him into this. Not yet. Not until she understood what she was dealing with. A scraping sound from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was in the cabin. Sarah's heart hammered as she killed the flashlight, plunging herself into complete darkness. The footsteps moved across the floor above, boards groaning under the weight. They weren't trying to be quiet. Whoever it was knew she was here. "Sarah?" A woman's voice called down through the floorboards. "I know you're down there, honey. We need to talk." The voice was familiar, but Sarah couldn't place it immediately. Elderly, with a slight rasp that spoke of years of cigarettes. The footsteps moved toward what Sarah assumed was the basement door. "I'm not going to hurt you, dear, but you're in danger up here alone. There are people looking for you." Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall, her mind racing. The journal had mentioned someone called the Keeper. Could this be her? And if people were looking for her, who were they? Light spilled down the stairs as the door opened above. "Sarah, please. I'm Eleanor Thorne. I think you've read about me." Eleanor, the name from the journal. The woman who'd supposedly died in the fire 20 years ago. Sarah's mouth went dry. "I know this is confusing," Eleanor continued, her footsteps beginning to descend. "But your grandmother sent me. Clara knew this day would come eventually." "My grandmother is dead," Sarah called out, her voice shakier than she'd intended. "No, dear. That's what we needed everyone to believe." Eleanor's flashlight beams swept the basement, finding Sarah almost immediately. "Clara is very much alive, and she's been protecting this family for longer than you know." The woman who emerged from the darkness looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. She wore a heavy coat despite the warm weather, and her hands were stained with what looked like dirt, or something darker. "You're supposed to be dead," Sarah said, backing further against the wall. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Death is a useful tool when you need to disappear. The fire was real, but I wasn't in it. We staged my death because I'd learned too much about what they were doing to the women who came here. They? The ones who've been watching this place for generations. The ones who've been taking the babies. Eleanor's expression hardened. Your great-great-grandmother wasn't the first, Sarah. She was just the first to fight back. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly. What do you mean, taking the babies? This cabin, this place, it was never meant to be a refuge. It was a trap. They set it up to draw in pregnant women, especially those from certain bloodlines. Your bloodline. Eleanor took a step closer, her voice urgent. The journal you found was Clara's insurance policy. She knew someday one of the family would need to know the truth. The walls seemed to close in around Sarah. What truth? Sarah felt the world tilt. That's impossible. Is it? How do you think you found this place? How do you think every pregnant woman in your family has found it when they needed to run? Eleanor's eyes glittered in the flashlight beam. They wanted you to find it. They've been waiting for you specifically. The sound of vehicles outside made both women freeze. Car doors slamming, multiple engines. Eleanor's face went pale. They're here. We need to go. Now. Where? Through the tunnel behind that wall. It leads to the old mine system. Eleanor was already moving toward the stones Sarah had noticed earlier. Help me with this. We have maybe 2 minutes before they breach the cabin. Above them, heavy footsteps thundered across the floor. The basement door groaned open, revealing a narrow wooden staircase that disappeared into absolute darkness. Sarah's flashlight beam trembled as she descended, each step releasing the musty scent of decades-old secrets. Behind her, Marcus's breathing was shallow, his phone's light creating dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. This place has been here longer than the cabin, Sarah whispered, running her free hand along the mortared stones. Much longer. The basement opened into a surprisingly large room, its ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. But it wasn't the architecture that made Sarah's blood run cold, it was what the room contained. Along the far wall, dozens of journals lined makeshift shelves, their leather covers worn and faded. Between them, photographs were carefully pinned to the wood, black and white images of pregnant women, some dating back to what looked like the 1920s. Each photo bore a small placard with dates and initials. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed, moving toward the display. Sarah, look at this. Her mother, younger, pregnant, smiling with a hand on her rounded belly. The placard read, Catherine M., 1995. That's impossible, Sarah whispered. My mother was never pregnant. She couldn't have children. That's why she adopted me. Marcus was already pulling journals from the shelves, scanning their contents. Sarah, these aren't just random women. Look at the family trees in here. He held up a journal filled with meticulously drawn genealogical charts. They're all related. Distant cousins, second cousins, great-nieces. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her grandmother's journal from 1962. Eleanor's familiar handwriting filled the pages, but these weren't the rambling thoughts of a confused old woman. These words were sharp, purposeful, terrified. The child is due any day now. Dr. Whitmore assures me the procedure will be painless, but I've seen what happens to the others. The babies don't die, they're taken. Somewhere in this family line, something was awakened, and now it feeds on what we create. Marcus, Sarah's voice was barely audible. Listen to this, she read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each horrifying word. Mother told me about the ancestor who made the pact, Mercy Blackwood, 1847. She was dying in childbirth when something offered her a choice, save herself and her baby but bind her bloodline to feed the thing that saved them. Every generation, it takes what it needs to survive. Marcus had gone completely still. Feed it what? Sarah turned the page, her mother's photos seeming to watch her from the wall. Not the babies themselves, their potential, their futures. The children live, but they're hollow, empty. They grow up unable to create life of their own, compelled to find other women in the family line who can. They become the shepherds, guiding the fertile ones to this place when their time comes. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Sarah's mother, unable to have children, adopting her. The inexplicable pull she'd felt to the cabin. The dreams that had started the moment she'd become pregnant. "My mother wasn't barren," Sarah whispered. "She was one of the taken ones. And she led me here." Marcus grabbed her arm. "We need to leave, now." But as they turned toward the stairs, footsteps echoed from above. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the cabin floor. Sarah clicked off her flashlight, plunging them into darkness, and Marcus followed suit. "Sarah?" Her mother's voice drifted down from above, sickeningly sweet. "I know you're here, darling. I saw the car." More footsteps joined the first. At least 3 people moving around upstairs, maybe more. "We brought Dr. Whitmore," her mother continued. "The same doctor who delivered me and your grandmother and her mother before that. He's very excited to meet you." Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall, her baby kicking frantically as if sensing the danger. Marcus found her hand in the darkness, squeezing tight. "The family has been so patient, Sarah, so careful. We've maintained the bloodline for over a century, ensuring the pact remains strong. You should be honored. Your child will serve a purpose greater than you can imagine." A new voice joined her mother's. Elderly, male, speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Bring her up, Catherine. The longer we wait, the more difficult this becomes." Sarah felt along the wall desperately, searching for another way out. Her fingers found what felt like another doorway, this one partially blocked by fallen stones. She tugged at Marcus's sleeve, guiding him toward it. Above them, the basement door creaked open. "Sarah, there's no point in hiding. You can't fight what you were born for." The basement door slammed shut above them, with a finality that made Sarah's blood run cold. The sound of metal scraping against metal suggested a lock sliding into place, followed by heavy footsteps retreating across the cabin floor. "Mom?" Sarah whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible over her own thundering heartbeat. "I'm here, sweetheart." Eleanor's voice came from somewhere to her left, steady despite their circumstances. "Are you hurt?" "No, but—" Sarah's hands instinctively moved to her belly as another contraction began building. The stress was making them stronger, more frequent. "The baby's coming. I don't think we have much time." The basement was pitch black, but gradually her eyes began to adjust. Thin slivers of light leaked through gaps in the floorboards above, creating ghostly patterns on the earthen floor. The air smelled of damp soil and something else, something metallic that made her stomach turn. "There has to be another way out," Eleanor said, and Sarah heard her moving carefully through the space. These old cabins sometimes had root cellars with separate entrances. Sarah groped along the rough stone walls, feeling for any opening, any weakness they could exploit. Her fingers encountered cobwebs, rough mortar, and finally something else, carved letters in the stone. "Mom, there's writing here." She traced the letters with her fingertips. "Names, I think." Eleanor's voice grew closer. "What do they say?" "Margaret, 1962. Ruth, 1958. Sarah's voice caught as she continued reading. "There are so many of them. Decades worth." A chill that had nothing to do with the underground air swept through her. These weren't just random carvings. They were a record, a memorial. "Sarah," Eleanor's voice was tight with discovery. "Over here." Sarah felt her way toward her mother's voice, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance. Eleanor had found something in the far corner, a wooden crate, partially hidden behind a support beam. Inside were documents, yellowed with age but preserved in the dry basement air. Eleanor held them up to catch what little light filtered down from above. "That's Dr. Harrison's organization," Sarah said, another contraction stealing her breath. "When it passed," she continued, "the one funding his research." Eleanor's hands were shaking as she rifled through more papers. "Sarah, these aren't just medical records. They're contracts, purchase agreements." Her voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "They were buying babies." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The journal entries from women who came to the cabin, the strange pull pregnant women felt to this place, the doctor who always seemed to know when someone was in need. They created a system, Sarah realized. Draw vulnerable women here, provide care and shelter, then... She couldn't finish the sentence, and when someone started asking questions or refused to cooperate, Eleanor said grimly, they ended up carved into the wall. Above them, footsteps returned to the cabin. Sarah heard voices, Dr. Harrison's cultured tones, and another man she didn't recognize. The records show the mother's bloodline is particularly valuable, Dr. Harrison was saying. 3 generations of successful births with the genetic markers we need. And if she won't cooperate, the other voice asked, then we take what we need and add her to the memorial downstairs. The research is too important to let sentiment interfere. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. The memorial, that's what he called the names carved in the stone, the women who had refused to give up their children and paid the ultimate price. Eleanor grabbed Sarah's arm. We're not ending up on that wall, she whispered fiercely. Help me move this crate. Together they shifted the heavy wooden box, revealing a narrow opening behind it, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Cool air drifted from the darkness beyond. It's a tunnel, Eleanor said. Probably connects to the old mine shaft system in these hills. Another contraction hit Sarah, stronger than before. She gripped the edge of the crate, breathing through the pain. When it passed, she looked at the narrow opening with desperation. I don't know if I can fit through there, she gasped. You can, and you will, Eleanor said firmly, because that baby deserves a chance at a real life, not whatever twisted future they have planned. The footsteps above grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. They're coming back, Sarah whispered. Eleanor was already crawling into the tunnel. Come on, sweetheart, we're getting out of here. Sarah took one last look at the names carved in the stone, all the women who hadn't made it out, and squeezed into the darkness after her mother, praying they wouldn't join that grim memorial. The basement door slammed shut above them with a finality that made Sarah's blood run cold. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor overhead, followed by the unmistakable sound of something being dragged across the wooden planks, a bookshelf perhaps, or a heavy chest. Margaret was sealing them in. There has to be another way out, David whispered, his phone's flashlight casting wild shadows as he swept it across the stone walls. These old cabins sometimes had root cellars with external entrances. Sarah pressed her back against the cold stone, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby had been unusually active since they'd descended into this underground chamber, as if responding to some primal danger. She's been planning this for decades, David, every detail, every contingency. The beam of light caught something metallic in the far corner. As they moved closer, Sarah's breath caught. It was an old surgical table, its leather restraints cracked with age but still functional. Beside it stood a cabinet filled with medical instruments, some dating back to the early 1900s. My God, David breathed. How many women? Dozens, Sarah finished, remembering the journal entries. Maybe hundreds over the years, all of them thinking they'd found sanctuary. A new sound drifted down from above, the murmur of voices. Margaret wasn't alone anymore. Sarah recognized the second voice with a chill, Dr. Hartwell, her obstetrician, the woman who'd been monitoring her pregnancy so carefully, who'd insisted on those extra appointments, who'd seemed so concerned about the baby's unusual development. The contractions should begin within the hour, Dr. Hartwell was saying. The stress of the revelation, combined with the herbal compounds I've been adding to her prenatal vitamins, will ensure a premature but viable birth. Margaret's voice was coldly satisfied. And the child will be healthy enough for the procedure? More than healthy. The bloodline has remained remarkably pure. This baby will be perfect for our needs. Sarah felt David's hand grip hers tightly. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. The prenatal vitamins that had made her so drowsy, the insistence on natural birth, the way Dr. Hartwell had discouraged her from seeking a second opinion when complications arose. "We need to find that exit," Sarah whispered urgently. A cramping sensation in her lower back made her gasp. The doctor's prediction was already coming true. David was examining the walls systematically, running his hands along the mortar between stones. "Here," he said suddenly. "There's a draft coming from behind this section." "It's barely wide enough for one person," he said, "but it slopes upward. It has to lead somewhere." From overhead came the sound of more arrivals. Sarah counted at least 4 distinct voices now, all women, all speaking with the calm efficiency of people executing a well-rehearsed plan. She recognized several: the librarian who'd been so helpful in her research, the clerk at the county records office who'd guided her to the property deeds, even the nurse from Dr. Hartwell's office who'd always been so kind. "They've been watching me from the beginning," Sarah realized. "Every step of my investigation, they've been 3 steps ahead." Another contraction hit, stronger this time. They were running out of time. David had already squeezed partway into the tunnel. "I can see light ahead," he called back softly. "It opens into the woods about 50 yards from the cabin. But Sarah, you'll have to come through on your own. I can't pull you through this space." Sarah looked at the narrow opening, then down at her pregnant belly. It would be tight, potentially dangerous for the baby, but staying here meant certain death for both of them. "Go," she whispered. "Get help. Call the state police, not the local sheriff. They might be compromised too. I'm not leaving you. You have to. If they take this baby, it won't end with me. There will be others." Another contraction made her double over. "Promise me you'll stop them." David's face was anguished in the phone's light. "Sarah, promise me." He kissed her forehead, his lips warm against her cold skin. "I promise. Hold on as long as you can." As David disappeared into the tunnel, Sarah heard the scraping sound above cease. Footsteps approached the basement door. She pressed herself into the shadows beside the surgical table, her hand clutching the journal she'd managed to hold on to throughout their ordeal. "Sarah, dear, it's time. Dr. Hartwell is here to help with the delivery. Everything is going to be just fine." The footsteps began their descent, measured and unhurried. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to slow her breathing, even as her body prepared to bring new life into a nightmare that had been generations in the making. The morning light streaming through the cabin windows revealed everything with startling clarity. Sarah's grandmother sat across from her at the scarred wooden table, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Between them lay the journal that had started it all, its pages open to reveal the truth that had been hidden for decades. "Your great-grandmother Elena wasn't the first," Grandma Rose said quietly. "The women in our family have been coming to this place for over a century, each one drawn here when they carried daughters. It's in our blood, Sarah. The knowing." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her daughter stirred restlessly. "But why here? What makes this place so special?" "It was built by your great-great-grandmother Celeste in 1923 after she escaped from the asylum where they'd locked her away for refusing to give up her child." Rose's voice carried the weight of generations. She was told her daughter was born dead, but she knew better. She could feel the life, the connection. They called her mad for it. The pieces clicked into place with devastating precision. The fertility clinic, Dr. Morrison. They've been taking our daughters for decades. Each generation, they would wait and watch. When one of our women became pregnant with a girl, something would always go wrong. A medical emergency, a complication that required their specific expertise. And then, Rose's voice broke. Empty arms and broken hearts. Sarah remembered the smooth certainty in Dr. Morrison's voice, the way he'd insisted on the emergency delivery, the convenience of the prepared paperwork. But why? What do they want with our children? "Power recognizes power," Rose said simply. "Our family's gift, the ability to sense, to know things beyond the physical world, it's been coveted by those who seek to control such forces. They've been breeding it, studying it, trying to harness it for their own purposes. The journal's pages fluttered in a breeze that shouldn't have existed in the closed cabin. Sarah watched as they settled on an entry dated just months ago, written in her own mother's handwriting. Her breath caught. Mom knew. She knew, and she never told me. She tried to break the cycle by staying away from here, by never telling you about the cabin. She thought if you didn't know, you wouldn't be drawn here when your time came. But the pull is too strong. It's protection and warning all at once. Sarah's daughter kicked hard, as if responding to the conversation. The other women who came here, some escaped, like you did. Others. Rose's eyes filled with tears. The journal holds all their stories. Elena documented everything, hoping someone would eventually piece it together and end it. Through the window, Sarah saw movement in the forest. Not the organic sway of wildlife, but the deliberate approach of vehicles. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "They've found us." Rose stood with surprising agility for her age. The root cellar has a tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft. Celeste built escape routes throughout this property. "Come with me," Sarah pleaded, but Rose was already shaking her head. "This ends with me, child. I won't run anymore." She pressed something into Sarah's hand, a locket that hummed with warmth. "Celeste's. It will help your daughter understand her heritage when she's old enough." The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the morning air. Sarah recognized Dr. Morrison's voice among the others, calm and authoritative as he directed his team. They'd come prepared this time. "The tunnel opens near Highway 49, Rose whispered urgently. "There's a woman named Margaret Chen at the Riverside Women's Center. She's been helping mothers like you for years, keeping the children safe from Morrison's people." Sarah clutched the journal to her chest. "This has to end. Our daughters deserve better." "It will end," Rose said with fierce certainty. "Your daughter will be the one to finish what Celeste started. I've seen it in the dreams that have haunted our family for generations." The front door splintered inward. Dr. Morrison stepped through, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, his smile as cold as winter. "Mrs. Chen, how predictable. You've led us quite a chase." Rose positioned herself between Morrison and the root cellar entrance. "She's not here, Doctor. You're too late." But Morrison's gaze found Sarah immediately, as if he could sense her presence through the floorboards. "The genetic line remains unbroken, I see. Fascinating how each generation grows stronger." Sarah's hand found the cellar latch just as Morrison's men spread throughout the cabin. The journal's weight in her arms felt like the hopes and fears of every woman who had sheltered here before her. As she descended into darkness, she heard her grandmother's voice one last time. "Remember us, Sarah. Remember all of us." The tunnel beckoned ahead, promising escape and the chance to break a cycle that had claimed too many daughters. Behind her, the sound of struggle faded as she moved toward an uncertain but determined future.